This is a story from my childhood, one of the ones that haunts me to this day. Have you ever seen those memes where it says people react like a criminal when an unexpected visitor arrives at their doorstep? They freeze and drop everything they're doing and throw themselves to the floor to avoid being seen in the window. This is my story of how I became one of those people. At the time, I must have been around 7.5. I was visiting the Midwest, Kansas to be exact, from South Korea, where I was born and raised, and was just visiting family. Nothing major. On that particular night, the adults, our auntie, uncle, and parents, were going to have a date night, so our parents ordered us a pizza before they left and waited for it to arrive, so that we wouldn't have to open the door for anyone. My aunt and uncle had 2 kids, 2 boys, 15 and 8. I was about 7.5 at the time. My older sister was 11 and our baby brother was the young, tender age of 3. So all in all, we're ready to just have a fun night of games. After all, it wasn't often the cousins got together like this. They lived in the States and we lived in Korea, but we all loved each other dearly. We saw our parents out at the garage entryway. They made sure we knew the rules and we could recite them back to them. They also made sure we knew where the telephones were and the emergency numbers to accompany them. It's just going to be a typical night of no parents. Or so we thought. It had been maybe an hour after our parents had departed. We were downstairs in the basement in the playroom and were just watching a movie, playing air hockey, and being kids in general. We weren't being loud or anything, and even if we were, it wasn't much of a big deal, because the way houses were in Kansas, the basement are built in the ground in case of a tornado. I'd gone upstairs with my oldest cousin because I wanted to drink some chocolate milk and couldn't reach the cups alone, so we wandered upstairs into the kitchen, which was on the far end of the house. The others stayed downstairs continuing their games. We had maybe been upstairs for 15 to 20 minutes before, while I was drinking my milk, my older cousin was making snacks since we were planning to watch a movie. Then all of a sudden we hear the doorbell ring. I remember my cousin looked at me and told me to stay here because it was odd that the doorbell was ringing and it wasn't too late, but it certainly wasn't early. And I say this because it was summer. It was around 8 o'clock. My cousin started to creep towards the door quietly. It was unnerving for someone to be ringing the doorbell. We weren't expecting any guests. The pizza had been delivered before our parents had even left. And before he's even halfway to the door, whoever is on the other side starts rapidly ringing the doorbell over and over. The consistent ring echoed through the house, and by this point I had looked over towards the staircase and saw our other siblings starting to creep up the stairs, with the exclusion of the baby, who was still asleep in the crib in the guest room. The oldest of the kids, James, put his finger to his lips and told us to be quiet, to make it seem like no one was home, despite there being lights on. He crept closer to the door as the banging and ringing on the doorbell continued as he peeked through the peephole. I had never seen my cousin look so freaked out. His face drained of color as he backed away from the door rapidly, and he told us to go downstairs, but of course we didn't listen. Honestly, we thought he was playing a joke. Maybe it was some of his friends wanting to scare us, since he did cancel his plans that night to stay home and watch all of us kids. My older sister shoved past him and looked through the peephole herself, and for whatever reason, whatever was on the other side of the door made her have the exact same reaction, and she stumbled back from the door pale. At the time, I didn't really understand what was going on. I don't think any of us younger kids really did, but something wasn't right. After 20 minutes, whoever was at the door stopped ringing the doorbell and all was quiet again. It seemed like they gave up. Maybe they thought no one was home. If only we knew how wrong we really were. We all sat in silence for a while after this initially occurred. My other cousin, Kyle, mustered up the courage to ask his brother James who was at the door, and why James and my sister were acting so skittish. James told us there was a man wearing dark clothes and seemed to be carrying some type of package or large box, but he couldn't see his face. Of course, Kyle, being the little smarty pants he was, started to mock James, saying he was just being a scaredy cat and didn't recognize their neighbors. Kyle was convinced it was a neighbor dropping off a package that may have gotten mixed up in the mail, seeing as it happened all the time. So we agreed that this was probably the cause, until we realized whoever was ringing the doorbell didn't just leave the package on the porch. Which, isn't that what most neighbors do? In the case of no one answers, they'll just leave it. And why would they try to bring it over in the house at night instead of just waiting until the next day? But we thought it was over and done with, so we pushed it to the back of our minds. We didn't think it was important to call our parents and let them know what happened. It was over after all. We went back to the kitchen, grabbed the snacks, and started to head back downstairs until we heard banging again. It wasn't from the front porch this time, though. We were in shock. We froze in fear. It was coming from right behind us. We slowly turned and looked back in the direction from which we came from. We were currently standing in the dining room. We had already passed through the kitchen. It was like someone was banging on the kitchen window. You know, the ones that are typically above the sink, so your mother or father can watch the kids while they play in the backyard as they do the dishes. So James and my older sister Nicole got down on their hands and knees and they crawled back into the kitchen, much against our charging. Just as quickly as they crawled into the kitchen to take a peek, they crawled back out in almost hyperspeed and told us to get low and stay low as we crawled into the den further down the hallway. James had us huddled close to the fireplace, out of sight from the windows, and he told us to stay there. He was taking charge. He was protecting his home and family the best way he knew how. James quickly crawled away. I don't know where he was going, but I was scared. The banging was getting louder, and it was getting closer and closer. At some point I started to cry and remember Kyle put his hand over my mouth and my sister was hugging us tight. And around that time we saw James starting to appear back around the corner, baseball bat in hand. He crawled up another staircase to get to his room. He crawled past us and put a finger on his lips, and that's when we realized he was crawling towards the doggy door. He was attempting to close off one entrance to the house that wasn't locked. Thankfully, he managed to get it latched in time because we don't think the man outside had realized that the house had a doggy door. But when we heard the lock click into place, the banging became more erratic and more violent. Then all of a sudden, much like before, the banging stopped, but we heard pacing. Someone was walking back and forth across the porch, slowly, deliberately. Thump, thump, thump. His heavy boots thundered across the red oak porch, and then without warning the pacing stopped, and it became quiet, eerily quiet. Then the man called out, "Won't you open the door? I have a package for you." We didn't respond. We stayed quiet, or as quiet as we could be, with the way our hearts were pounding and how ragged our breath was. The stranger called out again, "Open the door," and again. We didn't answer. The man called out angrily, "I said open the door, I have a package." Like before, we didn't answer, nor did we make any sudden movements. The man banged again, this time directly on the panel window of the room we were sitting in. "I know you're there. I know you can hear me. Open the door or I'll open it for you." He continued banging. The window rattled and shook violently with each impact from the strange man. Thankfully, our cousin's house had reinforced windows, so they weren't easy to break. But unluckily, we didn't have any nearby neighbors, so we didn't think anyone could hear the commotion. But while he was making the noise, we took the opportunity to book it into another room to get a phone. At one point, while we were on the phone with the police officers, they asked us if we could describe the man. Then all we knew was that he was tall and wearing black. So Kyle and I decided to be brave, so if something did happen to us that night, they would at least have a better description of who did it. We crawled back into the den and dared to look out of a small corner of the window. We gently moved the curtains out the way, and Lord behold, the man was still banging. He had moved the shutters off outside of the window, and they were basically hanging off their hinges at this point, rattling with the wind. We made direct eye contact with that deranged man. Direct, soul-searching eye contact. I don't think before this night I had ever believed, but there is pure evil in this world. But when I looked into that man's eyes, I didn't see a soul. I know that sounds crazy, but those were not the eyes of a human. He was something unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Animalistic might be the word of choice, besides demonic. It was evil, unnatural, and something I never want to see again. When he saw us, he smiled, a twisted grin that I'm sure he thought was reassuring when he crouched down, so that he could get a better look at us. He then said, "Don't you want your mail? I can give it to you, if you only open the door." I remember grabbing onto Kyle's hand for dear life, and Kyle shook his head, and he threw the curtain back, and before we even had a chance to move any further, the man started violently banging on the window again. At this point, James had enough. He passed the phone to my sister and he yelled, "Leave us alone! The police are on their way and you're not getting in." After that, it seemed like the man panicked and the banging abruptly stopped. And when we heard rapid footsteps on the porch and Kyle and I peeked out the window again, the man was running through the yard past all the trees and jumped the fence. The wooden 22-foot fence at the end of the yard into the alley that separated the neighborhood from the old cemetery. We stayed on the phone with the police until they arrived, and our parents got there not long after. But the man was never caught, and we don't know what happened after that night. He just vanished into thin air. To this day, I'm 21 now. Whenever the doorbell rings when I'm not expecting a visitor, my heart drops. I break out into a cold sweat, and that's all thanks to the mystery package man. I work in a children's emergency room, and have seen and heard my fair share of things. I have multiple stories, but this one always sticks out to me, but not in a scary way. Several years ago, I was working third shift, and it had been an unfortunate evening. We had lost a child, a regular patient of the ED, earlier in my shift, and, well, that's something that stays with you. However, working in this environment, you have to go on with your day. You're allowed to mourn, but for 12 hours, you are there to help every child that comes through those doors. Usually around 3 a.m., the ED is able to start closing down hallways due to the lower volume of patients, and that night I decided to take a much-needed break away from the noise in one of the hallways we had just closed. I was hiding away in the unit secretary area of the hallway when I heard a child's laugh and footsteps running down the hallway into a room. Again, this isn't a particularly unusual thing because we have children everywhere in the hospital. However, I wanted to investigate because there shouldn't be a child running around unattended in the closed area of the ED. I walk in the room where I heard the child, and it was completely empty, with the lights still being off. Behind me I heard the same thing, but in another room, but this time the lights were switched on. Again I go investigate and it was empty. Confused, I turned off the lights and went back to the desk. I sit there for a few minutes and see the light switch back on in one of the rooms, and shortly after I hear the same laugh. I get up and start walking to the room, and as I get close I hear the same laugh and the light switches right back off when I get there. At this point I can hear my heart pounding through my chest. I knew something wasn't right. I walk into the room and turn on the light, and my heart drops. Sitting on the bed is the patient I had come to know very well throughout the years. It was the patient I watched pass away several hours ago in our trauma room. I immediately started tearing up, and I remember wanting to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He looked at me, smiled and then laughed, And just like that, he was gone. I haven't seen him since that night. Maybe I was sleep deprived and seeing things. But in that moment I felt a sense of peace. I knew he was okay. It is definitely an experience that I will never forget, and honestly one that I never want to forget. Back when I was 18, my mum and I had been doing work in the garden, so she was exhausted and went to bed early. It was winter, so it got dark early. I knew I would be the only one awake for the next few hours until her partner got in from working at 4 a.m. I went about my usual nightly routine. I rolled a joint and went out back to smoke it, as I did every night, as I was not allowed to smoke in the house. The house had 2 floors, and my bedroom was on the top floor. After I had my smoke, I went back upstairs and continued watching whatever. About an hour later, I decided I would have one more joint before going to bed. I finished rolling and got myself ready to head out into the cold. But just before I went down the stairs, something on my phone distracted me, and I sat back on the bed concentrating on that. When a minute or 2 passed, I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I thought to myself it was just my mum's partner coming home. Then seconds later, I realized I didn't hear the front gate open, and didn't hear the taxi pull up outside. I didn't hear the front door open, and my cat is on the bed next to me, so it wasn't him, and my mum was asleep the next door over. So what could that bang possibly be? I grabbed my taser, which funnily enough looks like a Nokia phone, so that my mum also didn't know about it, and stuck it in my dressing gown pocket and go into my mum's room. Normally she's a very light sleeper, but because she was tired from gardening, she slept through the noise. I wake her up and tell her what I've heard. She gets herself ready, grabs a metal pole, and we head downstairs. I insisted on going first because, in all fairness, my mum is like 5'6" and 130 pounds, has multiple sclerosis, and is holding a flimsy metal pole. I figured my taser would be a little better should we encounter anyone. Looking around, everything seems fine. However, the last room we check is the bathroom, which is on the lower ground floor, to find that the window that sits just above the bath is wide open, with one of our 2 bottles of Tresemme shampoo and conditioner, which were on the windowsill, have been knocked into the bath, creating the loud bang. Of course, we're like, how could this happen? The wind, perhaps? Obviously not. We were just really scared and trying to make ourselves feel better. It's 2:30 a.m. at this point, and my mum calls her partner to tell him someone has just tried to break in through the window and to please come home. His response, it's probably just a fox or something. Close it and go back to bed. You're just being paranoid. So we're like, well, you're no help, and we make sure everything is secure and call 101, the UK's non-emergency police, to report it. 5 minutes later, 4 police cars and dogs all turn up. They look around and then come to the door and ask the obvious questions. After doing a walk around the house and area, they come back again and ask if we usually keep our plastic garden chairs under the bathroom window. No. The police advise us that a dodgy gang have been doing strange things about the area, trying to break in through windows and steal whatever they can. They must have taken the garden chairs to stand on to help them get in. The police also advised that a house a few streets over had just been broken into, and everything was taken and the house was destroyed on the inside. I don't think they ever got caught. The thing that freaks me out the most is, had I not got distracted with my phone before going out back to smoke, I would have been outside sitting on the same chairs in the pitch darkness, where the intruders would have come around and seen me, and God knows what would have happened to me, as our outdoor light was broke. So to whoever tried to break into my house that night, let's keep it this way, and never meet. I would like to share with you a story that happened to my mother at the end of last year. We're from Catalonia in Spain. My mum is a doctor who works on a public hospital as a radiologist. She has no mental illness and is overall healthy, and the building is in good condition with no gas leaks or the like. She had a friend who went to her workplace to have some mammographs done. Everything goes as usual, and when they're done, my mum goes to an adjacent computer room where the images have been sent. She closes the door after her, and no more than 30 seconds later she hears the doorknob turn violently, as if someone was trying to enter the room. At first she thought it was her friend, so she called, "Come in." Note that the doors have lead protection to avoid ionizing radiation piercing through. But the knob kept turning. They were shaking it as well, so she yelled, "Come on in," and thought how rude it was for them to act like this. It was then she realized her friend could not be there, as she was putting her clothes back on, and there was no way she'd be ready. She explicitly told me she had the feeling there would be no one behind that door once she opened it. So that was it. She quickly opened it to see no one there. There have been a few other incidences around that room too. For example, one night there were 2 doctors with my mum, when suddenly one of her co-workers witnessed a bottle of gel flying at extreme speed against a wall. There was nobody there beside the 3. They were all astonished. I know this sounds a bit cliché. Maybe I'm not too experienced, but I can assure you she didn't make it up. One of her co-workers says there really is something wrong with that floor. No one really knows what. I live in a middle to low class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing happens. The type of place people go to and retire to sip piña coladas all day. However, a few houses next to mine lived a family that was not like the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the smallest girl we all nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was about 5 when I was 11, and she was always at my house. I knew my mom and the neighbors were concerned about a 5-year-old being outside all day and not arriving at her home until midnight on school days. But it was a quiet place where nothing happened, so no one got worried. When Tiny turned 6, her parents threw a giant birthday party for her, and all of the neighborhood kids were invited. I wanted to go. They had bouncy castles, water slides, and everything a kid would want to play with, but my parents didn't allow me to. I never knew why. I suppose it was my mum, as she didn't know her mum. I remember feeling very sad because everyone was there, and there I was alone, playing at home. After the birthday, things went back to normal, and one day we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what they did, except he traveled a lot and was always in meetings. I didn't pay much attention, and we all continued on with our day. One night we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops coming from Tiny's house. I'll never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mum, came out rushing us inside, yelling it was gunshots. Some of us got into my house, and we stayed there as the next door neighbor, a cop, ran towards Tiny's house. All we saw after the gunshots were a black van rushing down the street and almost killing a dog. Some men entered the house. Tiny and her siblings wanted to check what was going on, but everyone forbade them to go. All I remember was a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later, and after that day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a few months the house sat empty. Black vans with strange men kept coming into the neighborhood door to door, asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it. I knew the cops asked me about Tiny and the kids, and if they ever said something weird about her dad and mum, but I was only 11 and more concerned about playing Mario Kart on the Wii than what happened that night. Years passed and the story faded away. Now that I'm grown up, I asked my neighbor, the cop, what went down that night, as there were rumors the guy died. He said that night The man got a gun emptied into his skull, and his wife was gravely wounded but survived. Because he was a drug lord that was going to make a deal with the police to turn his rival gangs and some other people to the cops. The men in the van that were going door to door wanted to know where his kids and wife were, to also shut them up. As to his kids, his eldest son was found a few hours away in a neighboring town, his car set ablaze. He didn't survive. His other children are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope, wherever Tiny is, she's doing okay, and her family got the help they needed. I'm a 31-year-old male, Dutch but now residing in Uganda. This story happened when I was 13 years old. Before I start, there's important information that is crucial to understand what happened. I am Dutch, and I grew up in a town of about 60,000 people. I come from an upper middle class family and lived in a neighborhood that was built in the forest. The entire town is known to have a lot of nature. We lived in a big one-story house with 2 lavatories, 2 bathrooms, a garage, a big living room, 6 bedrooms, and a nice garden all around the house. My parents were never people that thought a lot about safety. We had a huge sliding glass door connecting our garden, and our garden was easily accessible from all directions. Also, I can't remember, but I think the garage door would lead to either my brother's bedroom on the right side of the house or to the corridor that would lead to my sister's parents and my bedroom. This could be locked. My father's solution was to park his car in front of the garage door so that no one could get in. This house gave me the creeps ever since I can remember. My parents got a divorce when I was 8, and I lived with my mother, and I was finally able to leave my dad's house. The story I want to tell you happened when I was 14. I was playing soccer and actually got recruited for the youth academy of a team that played in the highest tier of Dutch soccer. This info was relevant later. We had a vacation impending at the time. Me and my best friend wanted to have a sleepover, and my dad had gone on vacation and his house was empty. So, as normal hormonal teenagers, we decided we wanted to spend a few nights in his house, watch movies, stay up late, play games on the PlayStation, typical things that 14-year-olds want to do. The day was perfectly normal, and as it became night, around 10 p.m., we start to hear upbeat music coming far from the distance. We decide to check it out. We leave my father's house and we follow the direction where the music is coming from, and it leads us out of the neighborhood onto a cycling lane with lots of bends that go through the forest. I used to take this way all the time to reach the soccer club, so I knew it by heart, as I did know the forest quite well. I told my friend that the music is most likely coming from the horse stables and that they probably have something like a teen disco, and that it might be fun to see if we can sneak into the party and have some fun. We continue on our way following the music, and Lord behold, the music did come from the horse stables. Now the only way I know to reach the horse stable was to go on the paved cycle lane and walk a kilometer on an unlit dirt path. The path was on both sides and covered by the forest, with the stables straight ahead of us. While we were making our way on the path and getting all psyched up by the idea of crashing a party, as we were a bit loud, on 2/3 of the way we hear a loud rustling coming from the left side of the forest. We are right on the side of the path, and this person emerges from it, completely dressed in black, with a long Matrix-style jacket and a black hat to go. We both brush it off as a man who was looking for his dog or something, but I'm a bit freaked out, and softly elbow my buddy and say, "Man, what the hell would he come out into a forest like this for at this time of night? Wonder what he's doing." He responds with, "It's probably nothing. Don't be so scared. We live in a town where nothing happens." His answer convinced me to continue. As we walked towards the stables, we walked towards the person, and he walks in our direction but stays on the other side of the path. The closer we got, the more my gut is telling me to get the hell out of here. I poke my buddy again. Dude, I really don't like this. Call me a coward, but I'm getting really uncomfortable. Don't want to go to the stables anymore. I'm freaking out. And before he has time to respond, the guy is inches from us and yells, "Come back here." And he starts running after us. Oh crap. I see that my friend is slowing down to catch his breath, and I run to him and tell him to dive into the bushes and hide. While I run, hopefully he'll follow me. He hides in the bushes while I scream loudly and run for all I'm worth, looking behind me to see where the guy is, and he's still chasing me. I have no idea where I can hide from him. The bicycle lane is just straight for the next 500 meters or so, and I keep running. I finally reach the part of the lane where there are several short bends, and after I run the third, I see a small patch where I jump in and dive behind some bushes. I hear the guy running, and he passes me, with him shouting, "Wait, come here, you little brats." I remain silent and in my hiding spot. I hear the footsteps going further away. I make my way back to where my friend hid from him, but without using the cycle lane. I reach the place and call his name, and he emerges from the bushes, and we decide to go back to my father's house, but take a big detour in a different direction to where the guy ran. Nothing happens while we're heading back. We reach the house safe and sound, quickly go inside and lock every door and window. We go into my dad's room, which is all the way at the back of the house, and turn on the TV, still freaked out and super scared of what had just occurred. I still feel unsafe and uneasy. I close the curtains and slowly start to calm down. My friend stays quiet for a second, and we try to keep our minds busy with a movie. I wish the story just ended there. Until today, I'm not sure what happened next. Was it the same person or just a coincidence? But halfway through the movie, we both hear footsteps coming from the garage door, in the corridor heading into the living room. I quickly lock my father's bedroom door. I secure another window that leads to the bathroom straight into his room and lock the bathroom door also. I look at the last door. He has 3 doors that leads into his bedroom that lead into the back garden. I open the door and quickly slip out behind his room, grabbing 2 spades, and slip into my father's room, brandishing my 2 new weapons. For 30 minutes we heard footsteps in his house. I see a shadow in the living room from the gap in the curtains, but not well enough to make out who it was. And just like that, it was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We were on high alert. As soon as daylight arrived, we left the house and headed to my mum's place and tell her the story. My dad calls me 2 weeks later. He returned from his vacation and he knows that I stayed a night with my friend. My mum told him the story, and he asks if I trust my friend, which I confirm. He proceeds to tell me his hard drive from his computer was stolen while he was on vacation. Not his brand new TV, not my brother's TV or PlayStation, and not a whole computer. Nothing looked like anything was wrong until we tried turning on the computer and nothing was there. Someone broke into his house specifically to steal his hard drive. I don't know if it was the man chasing us in the forest. The more I think about it, the more it would not make sense. He came from the forest in the opposite direction where we were coming from, so he didn't follow us, I think? Why chase us so obviously if he wanted to steal something so specific? But the chances of those 2 things happening in the same night is also highly unlikely. When I was a senior at Purdue University, my great-uncle Hank was in a serious car accident and hospitalized. My dad and I were very close to Uncle Hank. He was my confirmation sponsor when I was a kid, and acted like another grandpa to me as a kid, and was by far my dad's favorite uncle. So we were very concerned to hear this news. When the doctor spoke to the family, he unfortunately did not have a good prognosis. He didn't expect Uncle Hank to live longer than a few weeks. After he was hospitalized, several of Uncle Hank's kids came back to Indianapolis in order to be with him before he passed. One night a week or so after the accident, my father received a phone call from someone at the hospital, informing my dad that Uncle Hank had passed. My dad thanked them and immediately called his cousins that he knew were at the hospital that night. Here was where the story gets strange. My dad's cousin answered the phone, obviously shaken and crying, but incredibly confused as to how my dad knew that Uncle Hank had passed. He told my dad that Uncle Hank passed less than a minute before my dad called, and that the doctors and nurses were still in the hospital room, turning off all the machines and speaking to the family. There was no one outside of the doctors and nurses and family in that room that knew of his passing, let alone someone who could call my dad so soon after it had happened. My dad's cousin checked with the nurses station, and no one there had called my dad, and they didn't have his phone number on file. We really have no explanation as to who or what called my dad that night to inform him of Uncle Hank's passing. I catered at a family reunion for 200 people. I knew from the very start there was going to be problems because no one wanted to pay the remainder of the bill. 50% deposit to hold the date was already received and cashed, but no one had a plan on how to pay the remainder. So I told them that I wasn't putting the food out until I received payment. About an hour and a half passed and I had collected most of the remaining cash. About $3,000, and someone wrote a check for a couple of $100 to cover the rest, which bounced and took 4 months to recover. Once the food goes out, everyone seems happy, except the event space owners who were super shady from the beginning. We are actually at the second location that they own because the first wasn't available. Classic bait and switch. Anyway, the venue owner tells me that the space is booked for a second event that starts in half hour. Personally, I don't care because I got paid and just wanted to gather my equipment and leave. I come to find out the second group is a college fraternity that had gotten kicked off campus for violence, so they throw their parties elsewhere. I told my team to leave. Don't clean up, don't help me pack up, just leave now. The frat boys are already starting with their family group reunion, and no one is remotely close to prepared to leave the family reunion. I grab all my equipment after hiding the cash in my truck and take off without saying a word. By the time I got home about 35 minutes later, there's a shooting in the local news. 2 dead, 4 in critical condition from the venue that I just left. My mum was in training to become a nurse while she was pregnant with me, and one of the places she worked on was an old psychiatric hospital, since abandoned. One night while pregnant, she was on the late shift, with an early shift the following morning, and it was snowing. So my dad insisted she stayed in the nurses' quarters, which is a separate building from the hospital, rather than risk the drive home. Not happy with the idea, but understanding the reasons, she stayed and didn't sleep the entire night. A nurse had previously ended her life in the nurses' quarters, and there was nobody else staying there, so she was ever so slightly terrified. She said she heard whispers, saw shadows, and was generally a wreck by the time she had to go back to work in the morning. Side note, I like to joke that the ghosts there are the reason I have so many spooky experiences, and why when I go home the activity there is amplified, saying that they attach themselves to me and follow her home, and stayed with me after birth. This usually ends up with my mum being freaked out. Also, a friend from home was experienced working in the local hospital administration block. Their office had a connecting wall with the morgue, and on multiple occasions while the morgue was known to be empty, sounds were heard through the walls, like things moving, people walking, and something scratching on the walls. My name is Gigi, and I was 14 at the time. This happened about 4 years ago. That day, my little brother Noah was sick and had already spent 3 days in bed. He had a high fever, no big deal. The only real trouble was that he was 6 and obviously got our entire attention for that week. So yeah, that day my parents went out to buy his medicine and left me alone to take care of him. They also asked me to bring all of my brother's toys inside so they wouldn't get wet from the rain that was coming later that day. So I did as I was asked. I took care of Noah and I brought some of the toys that were laying outside. I was pretty tired that day, and I thought that I could do the rest later. So I went inside and sat down on the couch to watch TV before I had to prepare for my brother's lunch. I was zapping through the channels and wasn't really aware of what was going on around me. About 10 minutes later, I heard 3 honking noises coming from the street and didn't really pay any attention to it. It could have been the neighbors or a car passing by. Then I realized how late it was and that I had to go to the kitchen and start making my brother's lunch. Noah was resting upstairs, so I was in the kitchen cooking his meal. The thing is, my kitchen has a large window offering a view on the street, and I saw my neighbor a bit worried out of his car looking around. Once again, I didn't pay any attention to it and was focused on the food. At a moment, I opened the fridge and had a weird feeling like someone was there staring at me. I closed the fridge door and looked at the window, and there was a person standing outside close to the window looking in. Now I don't know why, but I can't for the life of me remember what that guy looked like. There's a stranger standing outside staring at me, and I wanted to scream for help, but I just couldn't. I felt like the only thing that I was going to do was take my brother and leave the house via the back door. I know it's a bit excessive, but I was 14 and imagined the guy would break the window in any moment to come in. So on my way to Noah's room, I noticed the guy following me very calmly through the window. Imagine my surprise when I found the front door a little open. I'm certain I didn't close it correctly when I brought his toys back in, and because of that, I now have the habit to check at least 3 times if I lock the door for sure. When I saw the door, I understood, and eventually got a few seconds to go upstairs instead of closing it because he was close enough to get in before I reached it. So instead I ran upstairs, rushed into my brother's room and closed his bedroom door. Noah was very weak and kind of upset because of the noise I made downstairs. It could seem unimportant, but hearing him complain made me realize we couldn't leave anymore, and while I was thinking I heard someone coming up the stairs and literally crapped myself. In a desperate move I opened the window, and fortunately underneath it stood Noah's big-ass trampoline, the one with a net around it. The only thing reasonable for me was to throw my brother onto it and jump, hoping we wouldn't break our bones. Luckily, the first floor was only 4 meters high. When we landed on the trampoline, I could hear the bedroom door open. Now, Noah says while getting off he saw a face, apparently of someone with a beard, white eyebrows and a hoodie, and a great psycho smile. I didn't, but I believe him. We got off and started running the streets. While I was running, I heard a voice behind us screaming, "Gigi?" I turned around and was relieved to see it was one of our neighbors, the one observing the street prior, that was waving at us to come inside their house. I was very happy to go into their house, as we used to go over and play with their kids all the time. He closed the door and we waited in there for our parents to return. We were there with his wife and kids while he was waiting out there. Funny thing he explained later is that he saw everything. He honked at the stalker because he was standing in the middle of the street looking at the house, and he also saw the guy walk into the house and a girl throwing her brother through the window. It was very funny when he told it back to us. So my parents came back and were ironically planning a good little evening, and they brought pizzas and a movie along with the medicine. So imagine how stupid they looked when they saw police cars and us waiting with them. We explained everything and later moved elsewhere. We were already looking for a new place anyway, but that really gave us the motivation to search really hard. We don't know what happened, but when the cops came in, the back door was open and there was no one inside, so obviously he bolted. As I said, I still think about it sometimes, and there's no way I will ever know who that guy was. I also realized if I had done what I was asked and brought the trampoline back in the garage as I was supposed to, well, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. The only thing I regret is that now Noah is 10, we got rid of his old toys, as well as the trampoline, which means we can't make that jump thing if it happens again. So to the creepy stalker, let's not meet. In my hometown in South Texas, There's a hospital that is abandoned. It has an extremely demonic presence. I have 2 friends who have gone inside and ventured down to the basement level. There, they have heard growling and seen glowing red eyes. That was 8 or 9 years ago. My little brother, who is 17, has had friends go into the basement there and encountered the same thing, including the stairs that leave the basement to be in a completely different spot than when they entered. At night, if you get close, it feels like your heart is being clenched tightly. It's hard to catch your breath, as if something is sucking the air out of your lungs. The feeling of despair and panic just engulfs you. You just feel the need to get away from there as soon as possible, and that's just coming into the parking lot around 8 p.m. I haven't ventured inside, but the feeling I described are what I have felt along with my wife. The presence is intense and extremely powerful. My wife also claims to have seen some stuff. When I was 16, I had just gotten my first car and had it about 3 weeks. This guy walks up to me at a gas station and asks to use my phone. Naive and trying to be nice, I let him use it, but he walks away for a minute and then walks back out with an older guy. I didn't know at the time, but he had taken my SIM card out my phone. Then, they get into the back seat of my car. A friend of mine was in the front, and he asks if I will give them a ride up the street. At this point I was kind of nervous and just wanted them gone, so I thought this would get rid of them. It was literally like a minute drive to this bar, so I figured okay, let me just do what they want and hopefully they'll be gone. They were kind of intimidating, especially to 16-year-old me. But as I started to drive, he says, "Take this right, go down this road," which happened to be on the road I live on. So I thought, cool, I'll drop him off and go home. Well, I get to the house he wanted to go to, but then the other guy, who looked a bit scary looking, gets into my car again, and they say, "Take us to Wendy's and bring us back." It was about 5 minutes away, so I figured I would get these guys their Wendy's and that would be it. So I take them through the drive-thru, get food and start to head back to my house. But he says, "No, take us up the street." At this point I tell them, "Is this it? I need to be getting home." And he's like, Yeah, just drop us off. It's like 5 minutes away." I still haven't got my phone back, and I was too scared to ask at this point. And that's the least of my worries, really. I drive and get to this dirt road, really freaking out now. We come to an area surrounded by trees, kind of a big circle and big enough to turn around, so I start to turn around because there are no houses. At this point he reaches up from the back seat and throws my car into park and grabs me. My friend jumps out and tries to run, but one of the other guys sees him and hits him, but got away. It was dark and hard to see. He then pulls out a firearm and tells me to get out. I'm really scared, thinking that I'm about to lose my life. He hits me in the mouth with the gun and tells me to give him everything. I had some money in my pockets that I hand to him. Then they all get into the car and drive off. I'm miles away from anywhere and start walking, no phone, freaking out. I called out my friend's name and didn't hear anything. I walked a few miles to a gas station and cops are there. I guess my friend made it there and called, and I called my dad and told him what happened. It was the scariest moment of my life, and I should be dead. My face was all busted up when we got to the police station. We tell them everything. They think we were buying drugs from these guys and are trying to get me to tell them who it was. Then they pull out a book of pictures. After a half hour I see one of them who hits me. I knew it was him and instantly told them. A few weeks later I heard that he had stolen another car, got pulled over, ends up stealing a cop's car and is chased down. He gets out and tries to cut across a train track with a train coming and falls, and it severed his leg. Justice was served, I guess, but it doesn't end there. Years later I saw him at a bar on crutches, hobbling around, and I was satisfied. Then a few years later he got hit by a car one night, and that was it. I know this is hard to believe, and whether anyone believes me or not, I don't care. It's very true, and I've always felt I should be dead. But I'm not, and he is. So to the guy who almost ended my life, I know we won't meet again. The hospital I used to work at was extremely haunted. The 6th floor had been disused for a long time. It was the top floor, and no one ever went up there. There were times when I'd be using the elevator when I'd look on the little panel above the doors to see where it was at. And there would be times it would be on the 6th floor. As far as I was aware, only the janitors had the keys to that floor, as well as the night security staff. There would be absolutely no reason anyone should ever be up there. But more often than not, when I saw it, I'd feel a chill run up my spine. I can't remember what it was used for, as I haven't worked there for some years. Anyway, at one point in time, I was working the night shift. It was extremely late, around 4 a.m., and I was fairly tired already. It was a very slow night, and I had spent some time chatting with some of the other nurses. I get paged to go to a different floor, so I make my leave and head to the elevator. As the doors chime, I step in and look around me. There's no one in the elevator, so I jump on and descend 2 floors. But instead of opening on the 5th floor where I needed to get off, it kept on going. Now, in order to reach the 6th floor, you have to have a special key on the elevator itself in order for it to even take you up there. So at this point I was getting freaked out. It reached the 6th floor and the doors dinged. They opened, and I looked around. I was on the fabled 6th floor. I knew I'd only be a few minutes late, but I couldn't risk having a look around. I was so fascinated with why this top floor had been abandoned. I looked around. There were some papers still at the nurse's station. Doors were open. A thin layer of dust actually covered a lot of it. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I wondered if any security members ever actually came up here, or if they had any reason to. I started walking around when I heard what sounded like a chair, one of those chairs on wheels, move ever so slightly, like it was pushed. I turned to look in the direction of the sound, to see said chair move from just behind a desk. I gave a shudder, and at that point I'd had enough spooks, and I turned around and pressed the button at the elevator. The elevator was on floor 1 apparently, so I had to wait a little while. I turned around, pushing the button frantically, but there was nothing going on. I looked and saw the numbers start to ascend, 2, 3, and that's when it happened. I heard the chair. It sounded like it was pushed with a lot of force. I looked behind me, and sure enough, the chair is rolling towards me at high speed. I tried to move out of the way, and it slammed into the doors with a loud thud. I looked and shouted, demanding to know who it was. At this point, I was convinced a member of the security team must have come up, not locked the elevator, summoned it up, and then were trying to prank me. I knew the guy who was on shift, Bradley, so I shouted out to him, "Hey Bradley, if you're messing around with me, you know I'm going to tell the supervisor." So I started walking up, no longer feeling scared but brave, convinced Bradley was there joking around with me. There weren't many places to hide. Most of the doors were propped open with door stoppers. I looked around. It was pretty freaky, but I simply couldn't see him. Where could he have concealed himself? I knew it must have been him. So I started making my way back to the elevator. It was stuck on the 4th floor. Who knows what was going on? I waited and waited, and it still didn't come. And then I thought I'd call Bradley on his phone. I'd hear the ringer, or at least the vibration, find out where he is, and beat him at his own game. So I pulled out my phone and started to ring him. It rung, but even though I heard quite attentively, I still couldn't hear him. After about 30 seconds of ringing, which is a substantial amount of time, the door chimed and I went into the elevator. I pressed the 5th floor and started going down. I made it down to my floor and Bradley didn't pick up, so I thought nothing of it and knew that I'd beaten him at his own game. Maybe he thought the same thing I did and put it on silent. I got to work and at about 6 a.m. I get a phone call from Bradley. I ask him if he's finally man enough to admit that I caught on to his little game, feeling so smug with myself. However, his words sent a chill down my spine. "Bro, I only just woke up. What are you talking about? No one goes up to the 6th floor. I don't even think I've been there myself other than in the training day." At that point, a chill certainly went right through my body. Was he telling the truth? I ask my supervisor who was on night shift today, and she tells me it's some other guy, Edgar. I go up and call him and ask him why the elevator took me to the top floor. What was going on? He says he didn't have an explanation for it, but that if we wanted, we can check the security footage and try and find what the hell was going on. So we do. When we look at it, the chair was pushed by an invisible force and hit the elevator door. That was all visible. But he was always downstairs in his little cubicle. He never once came up or unlocked the lift. One of the freakiest things that happened to me. I spoke with a number of co-workers about it. Some of them believed me, some of them didn't. And a few of them even said they had their own experiences. Janet's was by far the creepiest. She explained in her story that this had happened to her once. She was heading up, and that the elevator stopped on the top floor. In curiosity, she took a peep around, but as she was waiting for the doors to go down again, did she hear some footsteps coming from behind her. She turned around, expecting to see the person who'd gone up there before that had unlocked the door, trying to apologize, she said, because she knew she wasn't supposed to be up there. But there was no one there. She was looking directly at nothing, but the footsteps were still approaching. She was getting extremely scared. As the footsteps drew ever closer, she started to shudder. She turned around and started hammering at the button of the elevator, but it wasn't coming up any faster. And when they finally were right behind her, they evaporated into nothing. She says that was one of the scariest moments of her life. My other colleague told me a similar story, but this one was by far the creepiest. Again, elevator. Goes in. Punches for the 3rd floor. It doesn't stop at the 3rd floor, so she punches for the 5th to try and get off, but it doesn't work. The top floor was her final destination. The doors open and she looks around. The lights are off. The place has been disused and abandoned for a long time. She gets off the elevator because she wants to have a peep around, just to see what's on this floor. She was a little nervous and worried that she wouldn't be able to get back down, but she knew deep down that if she really wanted to call someone, she could get maintenance to come and get her down. No worries. She started looking around the floor, interested in seeing what had happened here. As she made her way through, she started to feel an unearthly chill overtake her. She then very clearly heard a child's laugh at the very end of the long hallway. She squinted, wondering if it was perhaps a child playing in the hospital with the elevator and somehow managed to get up here. She started running, telling them to stop and that they needed to come back down. She swears she saw a blur run from one room to another. At this point she was angry. They had just directly disobeyed her, and they were in a hospital, for God's sake, on a floor they shouldn't be on. She was very concerned, and upon getting to the room she looked around. There was a desk, a cupboard, and not much else. She looked under the desk, and in the cupboard, there was nothing there. It was completely empty. No person, no anything. She told herself she must have just been seeing and hearing things. It was quite dark and creepy after all. But you see, there's street lighting all around the hospital, which gave a nice orange glow on the inside, so it was still fairly well lit by all accounts. She started to make her way back to the elevator, frightened, but trying to tell herself she didn't actually see anything. Upon pressing the button, did she hear a faint whisper in her ear. "I'm right here." She turned around and screamed, but there was no one there. She just about wet herself. She kept hammering on the door and pressing the button, but the elevator wasn't coming up any faster. She was sweating, in hysterics, and just waiting for the moment that the doors would open and free her from this torment. Just being up there was making her nervous. When the doors finally opened, she jumped in, and just as they were closing, she looked out, and for a split second, she thought she saw another shadow dart from one room to another. That was enough for her. She didn't actually tell anyone the story. The supervisor asked why she was late, and she said that she was just in the restroom and apologized, even though she looked very shaken up. It's only when I shared my experience that people started to share their own. They say that sometimes the elevator will take people up to the top floor, but most of the time people dare not leave its doors and go down the elevator again to not bother whatever spooks reside up there. I wonder if the reason they disused that part of the hospital is because of the creepy apparition. I guess I'll never know. This happened when I was around 12 years old. It was in the middle of the night at my house. My dad would work the graveyard shift. Since it was the weekend, I had stayed up most of the night. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m., and my dad had told me to lock the door and go to sleep, which I did. I went to my room and finally passed out, but only for about an hour. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking on my back door. It scared me awake. After taking a few moments to process what I heard, I decided it was probably just my dad knocking on the door. Maybe he just forgot something, maybe being really exhausted. I knew he had a house key, so I just told myself he was more than capable to unlock the door. But the knocking persisted. It was pretty creepy. Then the next thing I knew, the knocking stopped, and then it started again, but at a different location. Someone was knocking on the window in my kitchen. I continued to assure myself it was my dad. I didn't understand why he couldn't just unlock the door himself. He always had a key on him, and I felt pretty freaked out, so I wasn't answering the door. If anything, my dad would call me to open the door on my phone, which was right next to me. The knocking started again at another window. I was terrified now, too scared to get up and check who was out there. But the knocking wasn't stopping. And the next thing I know, the knocking moved to my front door at a harsher level too. That's when it hit me that I couldn't move. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't scream or talk or move a muscle. My heart was dropping at the knocking, and it moved to another window closer and closer to my bedroom, to the point where my curtains could see through. I still couldn't move. I didn't know what to do or say. I could only stay out as my fear consumed me. I moved my eyes over to the window and my heart stopped when I saw a man peering through. A tall man with a dark ski mask. I could hardly make out the details because it was so dark, but I think his mask had some sort of skeleton design on it. He tilted his head slightly. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of me. I closed my eyes hard and started yelling, telling myself it isn't real, over and over. I opened my eyes and there was no one there. I sighed in relief until I heard a loud whisper tell me, "I'll cut you." Everything suddenly stopped. I couldn't move again. I really couldn't sleep anymore that night either. It didn't feel like a dream. I've never experienced sleep paralysis before and everything was so real. I don't know what happened, but I pray that I'll never have to experience it again. It was one of the most frightening moments of my life that I've ever dealt with. I was home alone that day, so no one could back me up. But the following morning I asked my dad when he came back from work if he came back earlier that day and knocked on my doors and windows. He confirmed that he did not. New Year's Eve in Moscow. I was a dark-haired, dark-skinned man and was drinking with my significant other, who's a blonde woman. We're in a bar getting friendly with some locals who try their best to speak English, so friendly that one of us gave us a matryoshka doll that he was going to give to his mother later that night. They seemed a little too friendly, and maybe they just were that, but at one point I went to order more drinks and the bartender who'd been watching and serving us gave me a stern look and said, "You should leave now." I found this a little strange and unexpected, so naturally tried to question what he meant, but his face was drop dead serious. He looked at the friendly group, then at my girlfriend and then to me and repeated the words. I didn't really want to take any chances in Russia and wanted to see another bar anyway, so I grabbed my girl, the doll, and promptly left. Apparently, they had marked us to be taken. The steps, apparently, of what I've heard, are befriend tipsy foreign tourists, give them a distinct brightly coloured object to hold onto, and wait for them to become increasingly drunk. Make up an excuse to go outside either for a smoke or to go another bar, and watch as your crew waiting outside see the marked object, put bags over your new friend's head and push them into the waiting car. I'm very lucky, unbelievably lucky, that the bartender wasn't in on it. He recognized the doll straight away. My visit to Yorktown Memorial Hospital. We had heard this place was haunted, and that you can get creepy things happen to you if you are being a dick to the paranormal. I've always been able to feel things, and I have that eerie sixth sense some people joke about having. The day we went was Halloween 2018. It was about a 2-hour drive away, and supposed to be fun. I went with one of my best friends at the time, and my husband, both of which are huge skeptics. Right off the bat, when we get into the parking lot, the alarms in my head are screaming at me to not go in there. There's something in there that's bad, and of course, like the idiot I am, I go in. We get inside and are surrounded by candles on the desk, and are greeted by the caretakers and tour guides. We are told we can only use our phone lights and take photos, and begin our tour. The hospital had so many open doorways, but they had these cage walls to keep people from climbing over and taking things from inside. There was so much graffiti on the walls and holes in the ceiling and cracks. We come up to a room full of old dolls and a rocking chair, and I feel a creep on my forearm. The caretaker and guide tell us about a small child who will play with guests if they take her ball and roll it down the hallway, and if you take a doll from her room, she is not thrilled with you and might even scratch you. Of course, we couldn't expect a normal night on Halloween in a haunted location, because once we started moving on, the tour began to storm. We started following the guide to the next hallway, and they continued telling us about all the amazing artifacts in the hospital still intact, like the metal bed that was just a slab that so many have passed away on. Once we enter the kitchen, I immediately feel a difference in energy, like something was following us. The guide then asked us if anyone gets the burning sensation to speak up, because the end of the night when they did a lockdown investigation, one of the girls in the team with tattoos got burn marks out of nowhere. I didn't think much of it until we started walking down the hall where another patient, JT, passed waiting for someone to help him, because his friends had abandoned him on the doorway. I could feel cold on my hands and arms. When we went upstairs, we went to see the chapel, and I felt so lightheaded standing and staring into the broken room. Down the hallway from the chapel, I could smell sulfur and rotting eggs. The smell was so bad I had to cover my nose. When we walked further down the hallway, we passed a room, and a huge waft of soap hit my nose. and I felt a hard tug on my backpack. On this section of the tour, no one was behind me, and my group had gone ahead, as if it felt like I was being held back. I walked towards the front of the hallway and get an urge to look down the hallway, the one that no one was supposed to be in. That's when I saw a tall, dark, skinny figure, like a man with one hand bent out like he was waving, and a bright white light in the other, like a phone but brighter. I started calling my husband's name because I thought it was him. He had a tendency to wander off, and he came out of the stairwell that everyone else was on, and I couldn't believe it. I saw an actual dark figure with yellow eyes. One of the guys came up to me and asked if I was alright because I couldn't believe it. Was this the smell, and was this the tug? Or am I just crazy? When we finally got downstairs, I told my husband and the best friend in the car that I saw something, and both said that they felt cold gusts of wind and thought it was the storm. After that tour, I had night terrors for almost a month. I would wake up crying and shaking because I could see the figure in my room, but whenever I'd be able to actually get up, it was gone. I had recently moved into my own place. I was 19, and this was because my ex-stepdad was constantly being emotionally abusive towards me and my mum. I'm a female. I moved into a council estate in the northeast of England. Before moving into the house, I was warned it was a rough area. I was given the weekend to think over whether I wanted to move here. Over that weekend, I visited the house at random times throughout the day to see what the activity in the area was like. I decided it didn't seem too bad, as I was moving there to have a place to live and not make friends. I lived there for about a year and never had anyone bother me really, apart from one night. Let me describe the layout of this house a little bit. It was a 2-bedroom house with a back garden, with the gate to get to the back garden being on the right of the front door, which I always kept padlocked. My bedroom was above the front door with a window facing the front door and side gate. I also had a drive, which my car was parked on. I had recently started working day shifts as opposed to nights, so my sleeping was pretty messed up at the time, and I would fall asleep pretty early on in the night. On this particular night, I was in bed at 9 p.m. and started watching a show on Netflix and fell asleep pretty quickly. Around 11:30, I was awoken to a loud banging. I stayed in bed and hoped it would just be a one-time thing, but then the banging proceeded and I could hear shouting. I can't remember what was being said as I was pretty freaked out. Living by myself and no reason for anyone to be knocking at my door. Then, while someone proceeded to bang on the front door, loud enough to sound like they could have broken it down, another of the party started to shake on the side gate, which fortunately was padlocked. I then rang my mum, who was on night shift at the time, and answered quickly. I was crying, and quickly filled her in on what was going on. She stayed on the phone with me throughout the rest of the ordeal. I don't know how or why, but I got the courage to peek outside from behind the curtains and could see 2 blokes, probably in their late 20s to early 30s. They looked like chavs, dressed in tracksuits, and don't look very friendly. At this point, I'm pretty sure they're heavily intoxicated, with either booze, drugs, or both. After this is carrying on for about 20 minutes, I realized they're not going to stop unless I said something. So me being brave and perhaps a little stupid, I opened my bedroom window. I shouted down to them, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Now I can't remember the names they said, maybe Steve. The one who had been banging on the door said, "Get Steve out of here now." Me being confused because obviously I live by myself, and I said, "Who's Steve?" Then the guy replied, "I know he's there, his car's there." Bear in mind at the time I was a 19-year-old with a Toyota Corolla with a private reg. For obvious reasons I won't share the reg, but to put it simply, the plate is an abbreviation of my name, so obviously this Steve guy wasn't going to have my car with a girl's name on his plates. I replied to this guy and was like, "No, that's my car." He then proceeds to ask my name. Stupidly, I gave him my first name, but not my last. And then he asked, "Who lives here then?" I stupidly reply, "Just me." But thankfully after this remark, his friends, who had been trying to get inside my side gate, were like, "It's time to go." I watched as they walked down the street away from my house, until they were out of sight. To make sure they weren't going to come back, I rang the police and made a statement in case they did return. Thankfully that was the first and last time I saw them. Me being forgetful sometimes, I would forget to lock my doors. Thankfully that night, I had locked my front door because if I hadn't, I have no idea what would have happened. So to the creepy, intoxicated men, let's not meet again. I work in a residential treatment center for teens and kids. I experienced some weird things when I worked overnight there. I now work days, and there was one room in particular that the kids always dislike. So when I worked overnight, one girl moved into the room for another room, and always states she couldn't sleep in her new room because she felt like she was being watched. Months after she discharged, we had another girl move into the room. This room is different than the others, and the bathroom sinks in the room and makes a visual barrier between the main section and the sink area. She had moved a comfy chair over by the sink instead of by her window. When I asked her why she wanted it way over there, she said she feels like someone sits there and watches her at night. Now, just recently I had a third resident who was not here when these two girls were here and say that she doesn't like her room. We have 6 rooms on the unit, and this one is the 4th room she's been in. The other night I took her to the kitchen for some positivity time, and she admitted she didn't want to go to bed. I inquired as to why, and she says she has a hard time sleeping in there because she feels watched. She says she's been closing her shades at night, but it hasn't helped. She's never felt this way in any of the other rooms. The room is also next to our family room, where at night, a clock flew off the wall and landed several feet away. One of my best friends and I met back when we were 10 in the 4th grade, 2009. A common theme in our friendship was horror. We both loved and got off immediately watching and playing scary video games together. At the time, it was Secure, Contain, Protect on his laptop. Fast forward until the summer of senior year in high school. We drive up to this area of New Jersey called Hope Township. Real desolate farmland area, very few people out there. There's an area of road called Shades of Death that we've looked into for years that we're sure we'd eventually go to. So we drive up one time, just me and him. It's about an hour's drive from where we are in New Jersey. I remember it was rainy and extremely misty, this one chilly July night. We get there about 9 p.m. We're rolling down this long 10-mile desolate road when we spot a car going at 15 miles an hour in front of us. Keep in mind, these are rural New Jersey roads, with 40 miles an hour being the speed limit, and high beams are acceptable. We start going at their pace to match them, and I keep telling him how weird this is as we're driving. He looks at his phone for a few minutes, saying they're probably just some old people, but then we see a kid around our age turn his head from the back seat and stare at us absolutely fixated. My eyes have been glued to the road, so I decide to point this out to my friend. I also realized the car was packed with teenagers, with 3 other heads turning to stare at our car. My friend then says he feels bad about this, as another car is suddenly right behind us, also matching our speed. I get it was off, but I really didn't think just about how dangerous the situation could have been until the next day after we both went home, after my boy crashed at my house. I eventually pass the car in front of us and speed up to lose sight of them and peel off into a desolate rundown parking lot and turn off my lights so they wouldn't see where we'd gone. We both wait for them to pass and agree it's strange. When we went back up the road to go explore the state reserve, Jenny Jump State Forest, which is another story entirely. The next day we hear on the news that MS-13 gang members brutally ended the life of innocent people in the area walking through the forest with hatchets. To this day we still reflect on how badly the situation could have gone, and we are honestly curious to return. And we have. So to those kids on Shades of Death Road, whoever you are, let's not meet. I worked in a rural district general hospital, and I had a few incidents. The first one when I was working night shift. Due to the hospital being so small, you were the only on-site doctor covering the medical and surgical ward. You also have to clerk any administration from the emergency department. The hospital was built into a hill, therefore there was a corridor running from the ED to the other end of the hospital. But where the ED was on the ground floor, to get to the wards, you would be in the basement at the far end of the hospital. I used to use this corridor all the time in the day as it ran under outpatients, and so you didn't have to navigate around people. Anyway, this one night shift, I was bleeped into the ward, so I was walking along this corridor. Halfway along it, I felt really uncomfortable. Something was staring into the back of my neck. I just felt overwhelmingly unsafe. I sprinted to the end of the corridor and ran up the stairs as I didn't want to wait down there for the lift. Subsequently, I found out that the corridor used to have the morgue on it, but was moved some years prior. I've never used that corridor again. My second story, working nights in the ED. A man had been in the clinical depressions unit, aka a kind of halfway house between the ED and wards. He was really unwell and was basically for end-of-life care, and he arrested and died at 11 p.m. At 4 a.m. I sat with the nurses at the nurses' station looking at the door to the room he'd been in. Huh? Sun must be coming up, I think to myself, seeing the light in the room slowly increasing. A few minutes later, the door to the room clicks open by itself. Once fully opened, I realized it wasn't the sun coming, but the emergency light that comes on in a power outage. However, the power was on everywhere else, and none of the other rooms have emergency lights on. A few minutes later, the electronic doors which control access to the department stop working altogether. One of the nurses laughs. "We forgot to open the window to let his spirit out," so she pops in to open the window. 5 minutes later, an alarm goes off at the far end of the department. It's the pressure alarm for the isolation room. Basically a negative pressure room used for infectious patients to stop whatever pathogen is there being spread through the department. It has a sort of airlock, which if neither of the set of doors are open for a certain period will trigger an alarm. Nobody had been down there all evening. The room was empty apart from the deceased's patient mobility scooter which was being stored there. He obviously wanted to use it to get himself home. Let me give you some context. This story happened about 10 years ago. In England, if you want to go to university, you have to apply through an agency called UCAS to get accepted or not. I didn't get the grades I wanted and was not accepted to any of the universities I had applied to, which was a big kick in the ovaries for me. However, there is this other process called clearing, which for those of us who tried really hard but didn't excel at the exams gives us a shot to get into a handful of schools. I was fortunate enough that I managed to secure a place via clearing and attend a local university. It was only an hour's drive away, but I was 18 and wanted freedom. My 3 sisters and my parents were a handful to deal with, especially as 2 of them were quite young, and my parents can be overprotective and overbearing at the least of times. So I elected to move out and rent a place up at university. Now, of course, most people who got their applications through earlier already had their spots reserved, which meant I was in a precarious position, as when I inquired into the local dorms and such, I found that there was no room for little old me. there was nowhere I could stay, which is how this story begins. I was looking on the internet to try and find a place to live, somewhere that had my budget in mind, but that wasn't far from the university. Otherwise, I could hardly justify the expense that it was going to cost to my parents, as I couldn't afford to pay rent without getting a loan in the first place, which is quite normal for people here in the UK. After about 3 days of searching, and growing less and less optimistic with the prospect of moving out, did I finally find on one of the last pages of the search page a decent property. The price was incredibly reasonable, and it was completely private too. It was a very small apartment as part of a house. It was on the upper part, but the house had been changed into 2 or 3 apartments. I had the top one, and it was, funnily enough, the largest. It also housed the attic, and the only condition was that I had to relinquish control of the apartment during the hours that someone needed to get access from the attic. But this was very unlikely. But it was important to the owners that they had access to it, and that I would be willing to work with them if they ever needed it, which I was totally cool with. 18-year-old me was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to get to my new place. Then September rolls around. I'm there early, at least 2 weeks before school starts, and I'm so excited to be dwelling in my new place. I can't wait to make friends, invite people over, and was absolutely delighted with how much bigger it was in person than I thought. It was bigger than all our upstairs in our old house. I had a living room, somewhere to put my modest TV, my gaming console, my laptop, my stereo. I had a kitchen, all of these cool things to myself, and I felt so happy. But there was something I need to let you know. The apartment had a weird, heavy feeling to it, a dark vibe. I don't really know how to describe it, but I never really felt super comfortable there. At the start, I just assumed that it was because I was moving out for the first time and was missing home. But despite the fact that I kept putting excuses up, as the days went by and I made it more personal, I still never felt any better about it. The day comes where uni starts. I'm having a blast. I've made a bunch of friends, and within the first few weeks I invite people over to a house party at mine. It was great fun, but one of my friends, called Trisha, told me she felt really weird in my bedroom. I asked her why. You see, Trisha had drank way too much, so we dragged her to my bed so that she could sleep it off while the rest of us continued drinking and chatting and listening to music. She said that while she was in bed, she heard the cupboard creak. That's where I kept my shoes. She said she saw someone peep out, and then it was gone. She was drunk, remember, so I don't know how credible this statement was, and honestly, none of us took notice about it. But a few weeks later, I was going to bed, and just as I was falling asleep, did I hear something, almost like a footstep. I look around my room, tell myself it's just house noises, and try to go back to sleep. About 15 minutes in, I'm tossing and turning and still uncomfortable. Something's annoying me. I feel like someone's watching me. I resort to putting on some YouTube to try and get myself to sleep. Maybe listen to some funny videos, just some background noise to help me lull. About 15 minutes into the video, I'm just silent, with the light shining on my table. And I hear it again. A little squeak. I start to get uncomfortable. It's behind me, so I slowly turn my body to look, and I see that my cupboard door is ever so slightly ajar. You need to understand something about me. I'm very anal when it comes to organization. I know I closed that cupboard because I had organized my shoes within it earlier that day, and I liked it the way I liked it. There's no way I could have left it open. This was bothering me. I wondered if perhaps it had broken at some point. So I got up, opened both doors wide, and there I see a face. I just about crap myself. The face withdraws into the darkness, and as I flick my light on, I look, and there's nothing there. There's just a panel. Several wooden panels that make up the back of the wardrobe. I never even bothered to touch them before. I start to feel freaked out. So I start from the right and start banging on each individual panel. All three of them sound the same. I try to give them a shove, and they all feel solid enough. I put my ear up against the wardrobe, navigating past my shoes and hanging dresses and stuff, to get my ear right up against it. I can't hear anything. I wait a moment, and that's when I hear what sounds like someone pattering down some small stairs. What the hell is this, I thought. I didn't know what to do. I called my dad and told him I didn't feel comfortable and explained the situation. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and he really didn't want to take the hour drive to come up to see me and check out my room, as he had to be at work early in the morning. So, he agreed reluctantly after a little bit of convincing that he'd come down. He arrived, opened up my room and my closet, and had a poke around. He asked me how much my house deposit was, and after telling him he had an idea, he told me that he could break it to check. If there's nothing there, he'd fix it, paint it, and no one would be none the wiser. But that if there is, he knows there's something shady going on. He pushed with his hands, but it wouldn't budge, and that's when he got a hammer from his car and bashed it. With a few hits, the wooden panel splintered, and as he pushed it back, did we notice a light coming from behind it. It was only faint, and when we looked through, there was a tiny passage, almost like a crawl space, that led to some stairs. At this point, my father gulped. He was now very annoyed. We managed to go through, and he looked behind it. It was like a few latches. The panel could be easily removed, and by putting the latches back, no one would know that you could access it via this way. He was furious. We never found out for sure, but he was quite confident that the person who rented the apartment was the family member of a person who lived downstairs. It was a dude, early 40s, and I'd only seen him once in passing. He slept there that night, called in sick at work, and I called in sick at uni. We banged on the door downstairs to meet a very unpleasant and unkempt-looking guy. He asked us what we wanted, and he asked if he had anything to do with the guy who rented us the apartment. He said that they were family and that he could answer any questions we had. We were trying to play the idiot, pretend like we were completely oblivious to what we knew he was doing. And my dad told him to come upstairs and check something with him, that there was something funny under the bed. The guy was clueless. He came upstairs anyway, and when he got to the top, my dad showed him the hole and how they'd removed the panel. You could see the guilt etched on his face, and he claimed he had absolutely no idea of what we were talking about. But that's when my dad went into protective dad mode and started yelling at him, and told him that if they didn't give us our deposit back, the money we paid for rent, and a little bit more, that he would be calling the police for an invasion of privacy and who knows what else. The man quickly went downstairs, withdrew a whole load of money in cash, even more than what we'd asked for, gave it to us, and asked us please not to tell the police. But at that point my dad had had a change of heart. He told him to take his money and that he didn't care and that he was calling the police. They arrived, and it was a bit of a scene. Then the man actually got arrested. He got off though on some bullshit excuse, because it wasn't technically his house and la, which really annoyed me. Makes me think we should have taken the money, but ethically we simply couldn't do it. In any case, we moved out. We did get some money back, but it wasn't enough, and I ended up moving back home because I didn't have enough to find a new place, as they were all incredibly expensive. But I learnt my lesson. and it was a creepy experience while being home alone, something I am now quite afraid to do. These two experiences happened several years ago, before my grandpa, a retired doctor, retired. The first experience happened to him while he was trying to get some sleep in his room. He says that right before he could fall asleep, he felt as if someone was pulling the covers at either side of him with great strength, keeping him in place. Immediately he started wrestling to get free, and he did so for around a minute before the force disappeared. He then proceeded to turn on the lights and look around, but there was obviously no one else in the room, as only he had the keys. The second experience happened when he was in the dining room chatting with the nurses. Take into account this was a small, 2-story hospital, and that night there were no patients, when suddenly the power went out, and for some weird reason the emergency generator didn't go off. While everyone was still processing what was going on, the doors to the second floor started slamming closed, and multiple loud steps could be heard. Before my grandpa could calm down the nurses and reassure them, they stormed out the building, so he went after them. After a few minutes, the power came back and everyone went back in, although hesitantly. My grandpa is very skeptic and doesn't believe in ghosts or any of that, but when I asked him what he thinks caused those incidents, he says he honestly doesn't know. When I lived in England, I was a regular and then DJ at a goth club running at a functioning church in Greater Manchester. The caretaker and artist in residence was a kind guy who loved industrial music, pink mohawks and fire breathing. How the vicar decided to allow a goth night once a month in his church is a story I never heard, but it's still going strong and is much beloved. One packed night as we drank white wine straight from the bottle, my husband came running in from outside the church. "Call 911, he shouted over whatever Covenant or NVM Nation song was pumping at the time. My husband, James, is a calm and collected person, in direct opposite to me, more aggressive and forthright personality. But this night he looked panicked and frightened. "What's happening?" I asked. "Some people are being attacked." I started to rush towards the front door, as I knew a lot of my friends were outside smoking, but James held me back. "No." To find some quiet, I hid in the ladies' restroom and dialed 999. The call did not go well. "Hi, we need police. My friends are being attacked outside a church." "Where are you?" "Just outside Manchester, at Sacred Grace." "There's no Sacred Grace in Manchester." "Okay, it's just off Deansgate." "There's no Sacred Grace off Deansgate." I shouted into the crowd for the cross streets, and the 911 dispatcher was impatient. "Deansgate and Piccadilly in Salford," someone called back. I relayed that to the dispatcher, who sighed and said, "We'll send someone over," before she hung up. While I was on the phone, people rushed in and barricaded themselves inside. At some point the music was cut, and all 100 of us tried to be as quiet as possible. James told me he was outside with our friends, smoking, when he felt a fist go past his head. Another friend was punched in the back, and the other smokers all rushed inside and closed the door behind them. None of us knew what to do. There were people outside who just randomly jumped a bunch of us outside a church. What the hell? It wasn't before long we heard shouting and crunching, low male voices uttering insults, and we weren't sure what the crunching was. Eventually there was silence and someone opened the door. We thought everyone had got inside, but we were wrong. One of the organizers, Jason, laid on the ground with pools of blood around him. An ambulance had arrived and there were 2 paramedics. One had an oxygen tank in hand and shouted at the bystander, who lit back up. At this point it's a blur as to what happened after we watched Jason being carted away to a Manchester hospital. We were all shaken up and scared. From other scraps I heard the men who were outside said that they wanted to mess up some freaks, in their words. I refused to let a bunch of scallies scare me away from a night I'd really grown to love, so we showed up the next month and the next, until the horrible night where Jason was beaten so badly his jaw had to be wired shut, was just a story. In my regular life, I've always looked average. I'm tallish with blonde hair and blue eyes. I had weirdly colored hair once when I was a teenager, and I dyed it bright green, manic panic. But as much as I loved my goth nights and horror, I also had a day job. I worked as an IT person in a nice building in a nice part of Manchester, and I had to blend in. At the weekends, I wore too much vinyl and high spiked boots with too much makeup, and during the week I wore Zara slacks and sweaters and no makeup at all. The church wasn't just used for goth nights and weekly services, it also hosted other events. The artist in residence, Dave, put together, like art shows, and because we were regulars, we frequently were roped into helping out, serving drinks and clean up and provide soundtrack. One night, Dave and others in the congregation were exhibiting various paintings and sculptures and mixed media pieces. James and I were summoned to pull prints and pour wine for the attendees. It's actually thanks to this night I know how to pour a pint with not a lot of head. I wore a black work dress, slacks and a pink top. My hair was blown out and makeup was subtle. James wore jeans and a nice shirt. We had to look nice-ish because the mayor of Salford was going to be there. Art night closed, the mayor and her office assistant left. We cleaned up and I went outside with my pink mohawk. Dave and my husband were outside smoking, and we stood and made small talk until a man approached us. My heart pounded with fear, but I wasn't initially sure why. He didn't look like anything. He was probably 6 foot bald and wearing a t-shirt, jeans and sneakers. He was holding a bag soaked with grease from the chippy around the corner, and I was afraid of him. I wanted to run, but was sure that we would have somehow been worse than just pretending like things were still normal. "What's going on here then?" He nodded at the door. I exchanged glances with James. "Just a night thing for the church," James said. "Oh yeah? None of them freaks nights again?" That's it, I thought to myself. He's the one. I hadn't seen any of the men that attacked my friends, but I knew in my soul this was one of them. I hoped that my business casual bartender outfit meant he wouldn't connect us. A freak night? No, just an art night the church put on. I keep my voice steady and tried to keep my cigarette from shaking in my hand. Dave had been silent and said, "I should go talk to the vicar." He emphasized vicar. He probably hoped it would keep this thug calm. We nodded and stood in front of the door after it closed to hopefully prevent our visitor from following Dave. The man grinned at us. "Did you hear what happened? A bunch of people got messed up here a while back." I flicked my cigarette onto the street. "Oh yeah? That sounds awful." His smile broadened, showing gaps where his teeth should have been. "I heard they got a right kicking." My husband had cracked the door, and I stepped back towards the gap. James moved with me to go inside. Neither of us wanted to turn our back on him. Everything about this man seemed dangerous, and we felt things escalate. We may have blended in, but it seemed like reliving what he'd done was making him want to do it again. "Oh, and I was there," he bellowed, the last part, his knuckles white on his takeaway bag, his other hand clenched. Rage lit up, and his eyes and body were tense. In one quick motion, we both went back inside. The huge and thankfully heavy wooden door closed behind us, and the man pounded his fists on them until he grew tired. Thankfully, he was too stupid, not interested enough or too hungry to wait for us to go home. I don't know if the police ever investigated what happened, but Jason never returned after having his jaw wide shut. The night petered out a little bit just after this, but it's still growing strong now many years later. As far as I know, nothing like that ever happened again, and the man with the chips didn't ever return during any of the other events we volunteered at or otherwise attended. This was roughly 7 years ago, and I worked night shift on a psychiatric ward in the north of Sweden. I didn't believe in ghosts, but some strange shenanigans were quite often heard in the floor above my ward, at the doctor's office. It sounded like someone was moving furniture a few minutes every now and then. We had a nickname for the sounds, simply the ghost. One very calm night on the ward, the sound went on for much longer than expected, so me and my 2 colleagues decided to search for the source of the sound. When we went upstairs, we could easily pinpoint the dragging and slamming noises to one particular office of a certain psychiatrist. As soon as we opened the door, it went completely quiet. We stood there for a time baffled, and one of my colleagues let out a "hello?" and as a response, 2 of his desk drawers opened fast and violently. We ran away. The sound was almost on a nightly basis. I might add it isn't the only strange experience I've had, but it was definitely the most frightening and hardest to rationalize of them all. I live in a flat that only has 3 floors and doesn't have a lift. So if you live in the 3rd floor, you have to walk all the way up the stairs. This situation happened at midday while I was chilling at home and my mum was picking up my sister from school. So that meant that I had to let in the man who stops by every Thursday selling water containers. The thing is, he's supposed to deliver the water containers by 2 p.m. This time was the one that my mother told me specifically he should be there, otherwise no one's home. But on this day he arrived at midday. He rings the doorbell and I tell him on the intercom we need 2 containers and go downstairs. Once you go downstairs, there's a really long hallway until you get to the front door of a building. I greet him. "Well, hello there," he says, kind of amused. I make some small talk, give him the money, to which he tells me not to worry, because he'll take the containers upstairs. I tell him I can handle it, but he keeps insisting. While we're going upstairs, he starts asking me questions like how old I am, why I wasn't at school, and the like. Red flags immediately go off. I answered that I was about to go to work, and I definitely don't go to school. I felt so uncomfortable and vulnerable, it was horrible. He placed the containers at the front of my door, and I told him, "Well, let me walk you back down the stairs." And his answer still annoyed me. "Oh, I wouldn't mind being stuck here with you." Are you kidding me? As if that wasn't creepy enough, he then asked me where my mum was. "She's inside helping my dad," I lied. This man could be my dad, and he was hitting on a woman he thought was a schoolgirl. It really couldn't get more disgusting. That walk on the long hallway was the slowest I've ever had. I couldn't wait for him to leave the building. I was shocked, mad, and felt dirty. I don't know why. I said bye, and he had the nerve to kind of hug me, and I shut the door on his face and ran up to my flat to try and feel safe, but I didn't. I was turning on the shower tap when my doorbell rang not once but 5 times. And not the one downstairs, the one upstairs. So to sum up, I locked myself in the bathroom until my mum came home and I blurted out what happened. You know what the worst thing is? Besides the way the creepy man behaved, it's that my mum told me I was overreacting. I was so angry and disappointed that I didn't talk to her until I came home late that night. I told her to be extra careful if my 12-year-old sister finds herself in this situation, to not open the door to this man under any circumstances, and after that, she told me I was right. A middle-aged man with good intentions wouldn't assume you go to school, ask you where your parents are, and tell you that he would like to be stuck in the building with you. He still comes every Thursday at midday, despite my mum telling him there's no one at home. It is a little-known fact that when you relinquish your phone number, it can be redistributed after a while. And I think the person who had my phone number before me was both a deadbeat and in with the wrong crowd, because I constantly got harassed by credit industries looking for this guy Juan, who isn't me, and I get crazy texts asking for Juan. This was normal in the beginning, and over time it started to die down. After having my phone number for 6 years, I was getting a call from this strange number with my same area code, but they were calling every 5 to 10 minutes. Normally I would block it, but it was the same number. every time. So I was going to wait to Google the number to verify it was spam. Before I could get to Google, I get a text from the number that was calling me earlier that simply was saying a swear word in Spanish. Now, I'm white, but I knew what it meant. Usually at this point, I would just ignore it, then block the message, but I was intrigued because it wasn't a message promising me Russian hot singles in my area or any spam like that. So I decided to Google some Spanish comeback/insult and proceeded to barrage the messenger with some salty Spanish lingo. Needless to say, the messenger was less than thrilled with my response. This was when this went from amusing to straight up harassment. Later that day, I received threats in my texts and constant calls. I tried in English saying I'm not Juan and that I was just messing around. This didn't seem to work as they kept saying things like, "Liar, I know it's you, stop trying to hide." I was bored at this point and blocked their number. And the next day I get a text from a different number in Spanish telling me to watch myself and "you're dead." I decided to ignore this and blocked the numbers again. For a few weeks nothing happened. I figured they must have figured out that I wasn't this Juan they were looking for, but then I get a text, this time with a picture. I would have dismissed it, but the picture made me queasy. It was a picture of a tattooed man holding a piece of paper with my phone number, Juan's full name and address that thankfully wasn't mine, with a message saying in Spanish, "We're coming." What made the picture worse was that the man had a tattoo on his face that said MS-13 below his eye. At that time I had decided that I had enough and decided to change my number at that point. It makes some sense as I was in a different state anyway. I didn't do anything past this because deep inside I was hoping this was just a bad joke that was being played on either me or Juan. But if not, I hope they didn't find this Juan guy, or that they find me for that matter. It gives me hope that they didn't have my address, and 2 years since this happened, I haven't heard a peep. There's a well-known folklore in my town about the man in blue. In our town there is a very small hospital that attends minor ailments and sometimes care for the elderly. My mother worked there for many years. There's this folklore about the man in blue, you see. Lots of people have seen him, and even the local paper has reported on him several times during its run. It's not just known to the staff, it's known to the entire town. Sometimes on Halloween, people will gather around to see if they can get a glimpse of the man in blue from the window. Obviously they're not allowed inside, but in the spirit of things the hospital will give out candy or leave out bowls to those dressed spookily. In any case, my mum worked there for many a year and only had one thing happen to her that convinced her the apparition was very real indeed. She was attending a family friend of my grandfather's, a friend that he had grown up with in the village for a long time. He was reaching the end of his life, and my mum had to administer some kind of injection and just check up on him. Usual routine stuff. She was sitting and chatting with him when she realized she needed something from the other room. So she nipped out to get it quickly while he waited. Just as she was coming back, did she see a man in blue enter the room. She wondered who it was, and as she entered the room, she asked where the man in blue went. He confirmed that he'd never seen anyone, and she'd only been gone about 2 minutes. She shook her head. She must be tired. And so she applied the injection, and that was that. But that very same night, he passed away from a stroke. It was very unexpected, because that wasn't what was ailing him. But in any case, it was sad for the whole town. He was a very well-known and beloved character. My mum spoke about the event a few weeks later with some co-workers, saying that she'd seen a man in blue enter and how he passed away that same day. They told her it was definitely the antics of the man in blue, the well-known ghost. But there was one thing that the nurses didn't like to talk about the man in blue and his characteristics. It is often said that when he shows up, it's an omen of death, and the person he comes to visit is often the one who passes. Some people say he was a doctor who used to work here long ago, and he comes back to check out patients who are on their way out. I went to post-secondary school in a very large, well-known American city. In my time there, nearly everyone I knew was eventually robbed or assaulted. Many of the stories were appalling and altogether frightening. I thought I was insulated by self-awareness, but I was wrong. When I moved to the city, it was a culture shock. Country boy to big city in one night. The learning curve was steep. I lived in a large, semi-enclosed city centre. Tall apartments housed students from around the world attending a variety of institutions. We had our own mall, art centre, restaurant, etc. in this large complex sitting near the edge of downtown. There were a limited number of exits from our somewhat gated community into the surrounding city. It felt safe. Most students walked several large blocks through a brief industrial section and then crossed a massive bridge into the downtown area and either entered institutions there or caught mass transit to their destination. Buses, subways, taxis. Midway through my time at school, I was walking home alone one evening. My large portfolio bag, weighed with tools and tablets, hung by my side. It was mid-fall and getting dark quickly. Cool air came down from the hills, but waves of the day heat collected in the concrete and pavement and wafted up and swarmed around me. Coupled with the smell of fall and the energy of the city, it was intoxicating and distracting. To enter the complex from downtown, you need to ascend 2 large wide cement stairways, all the way up the final third set of a very high stair to pass through a mall which loomed above. All around were large planters and girthy pillars. It was a busy-looking large area with benches, curves and hidden spaces. I guess that's why I didn't notice him until I was nearly halfway to the final staircase. Then, suddenly, the appearance of a man in a trench coat, staring at me only 20 or so feet away, snapped me out of my daydream. I was always very alert when moving through the city, having heard many horror stories about students being ambushed by criminal lowlives, but I felt safe here with all the space around me, and had uncharacteristically let my guard down. I gauged the distance, his body language, the possibility that he may have unhealthy motives, and decided to play it cool and keep moving up the steps. If he moved towards me, I would bolt. If not, chalk it up to nerves. I was relieved to start climbing the stairs while he stood still and continued to look at me. I was smug that I was no longer in any danger. I would reach the double doors to the mall and be gone. As the stairs turned near the top, I casually looked back down some 40 feet to the courtyard. He was staring up at me and smiling. Relieved, I reached for the door handle, safety inches away, visible through the large glass doors. But it was dark. I tugged on the door, which refused to open. It was locked. It was later that I thought the mall had closed. Crap. I stood there for a moment, collecting myself. I had to go through the parking garage back down a level. The only other option was to make my way back out to the road and circle the massive complex on an empty sidewalk at night until I found another way in. I still felt very aware of the man in the coat. Would he approach me? Would he corner me? Was he armed? What if he wanted more than money? He looked crazy. And that smile. I pulled myself together and started back down the stairs. I couldn't see him anywhere. Perhaps he left. Without being certain of his motives or location, every step I took gave rise to increasing anxiety. I reached the bottom, moving cautiously, and looked towards the parking entrance. It was a lot of ground to cross, and there was far more cover for my would-be psycho than I was comfortable with. I was frozen, carefully scanning the scene and listening intensely. I was altogether unsure of myself, but needed to make a choice. Without knowing where he had gone, both options before me held equal peril. Back out to the road, into the dark, or forward, past the pillars and planters big enough to conceal him, into the enclosed garage, where no one would hear my shouts of distress. Just as I was about to move, I heard laughter and voices coming from the road. A group of people emerged into the lit area and began climbing the wide stairs facing downtown. I felt a rush of peace, and smiling to myself, I stepped in behind them and began following them towards the garage entrance. I was congratulating myself inwardly for my good fortune and my savvy, my fear melting away. Just as I entered the garage after them, I looked back, and he was there, smiling broadly with his arms buried in the pockets of his trench coat. Our eyes locked, and his broad grin widened further, stretching over his thin lips over his teeth. He was standing right smack in the middle of the entrance I passed merely seconds ago. He must have been hiding behind a pillar that I was only a few feet away from. I looked down at his drab-clothed frame and took notice that his arms appeared to be at his side, despite being in his pockets, which were high up on his waist. I didn't notice how unnatural that looked when I first saw him. His pockets must have been cut through, because I could make out the shadow of an object he seemed to be holding in his hands beneath the coat. So dirty, smiling, criminal lowlife. Let's not meet again. I used to work nights at hospital as a security guard. The work can be pretty dull, as for the most part people are quite decent and behaving, so there's not an awful lot to do. Maybe make sure no one steals from the vending machines, I suppose. Anyway, this happened one odd evening. I was just at my little booth trying to read a book when all of a sudden there's a commotion outside the front door. I jump out and go to see what's going on. There's a man. All he's dressed in are socks and a really long coat. He starts freaking about and flailing on the floor. I called into the hospital for help to see if there was anything they could do. I had no idea what was going on. And a few nurses rush out and see if he's all right. The man was flopping like a fish. The eyes went to the back of his skull, and he was very much having a fit of some kind. The doctors and nurses try to restrain him, get a gurney in, and take him inside to keep watch on him and see what's going on, and try and talk to him, as he was just muttering and gibbering. Obviously, I didn't hear straight away what was going on. I work security and am not a medical professional. But one of my friends who was a nurse in there comes out, and she tells me all that's gone on with that guy, as I was legitimately quite concerned for him. She told me that he would be all right, but that he had taken something very dangerous and that his life was in mortal peril. He was lucky that he made it to the hospital in time. Things could have been really bad. That's not the end though. They saved the guy, but a few nights later, he came back, clawing his way to the hospital door, still having a fit. It was the most bizarre thing. I couldn't believe he had returned. So I call back to someone else, and they come and try and escort him in. They get him on a gurney and he's flailing, and they're trying to talk to him and get control. But on that night, he took too much of whatever he took, and he passed away in the hospital. It was a dark day for me. It's pretty numbing to see someone in okay health, and then to be gone in a flash. A few months after this happened, I had all but forgotten about the strange man. When I saw him again, he just walked past the hospital door and vanished. The thing is, I was zoned out, just staring out the window. My book had gotten a bit boring, so I was just thinking about nothing. And obviously seeing this figure catches my attention. I look at him intensely, wondering how in the world he's there. It took my brain a few seconds to realize he was dead. and when I look, he passes my little window and vanishes. I step out the booth, look out, and there's no way he could have made it more than a few paces without me seeing. But he's simply gone. There's nowhere he could have gone. The hospital is colossal. There is literally no place he could have gone that I wouldn't have seen him at. This really confused me. At first, I thought that my nurse friends were playing a trick on me, and the patient hadn't actually passed away, as of course I'd never seen the body. Not that I needed to, their word was enough. But when I spoke to them about it, she gave me a confused look. "Oh, you've seen him too?" she said. "He likes to wander around the ground floor. I didn't know he also went outside." Turns out, after he passed, he's been spotted in several places around the hospital, just walking and then vanishing. Certainly unsettling for all us security and nurses. Anyway, that's my story.